Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth session of CME Palooza. This is our CME sound check from static to stereo learning, session sponsored by Medscape and Integrity CE. Moderator is Alex Housen, who is Director of Learning, podcast host at Right Medicine, and wears many number of hats there as well beyond that. Before I turn things over to Alex, of course, I want to give a big thank you to all of our sponsors. The CME Palooza Fall, our gold sponsors, Haymarket Medical Education, Med Learning Group, Platform Q Health Education, excuse me, Academic CME, ACHL, Antidote Education Company, Clinical Education Alliance, Daiichi Sankyo, these are our silver sponsors, by the way, DKB Med, Helio CME, Integrity CE, Medscape, Projects in Knowledge, and Talem Health. And our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, AxDev, Bonum Continuing Education, Catalyst Medical Education, Semiology, Excalibur Medical Education, Global Education Group, Goodwin Group, Infograph Ed, Integritas Communications, Iridium Continuing Education, Leading Learning, MedIQ, PACE, Paradigm Medical Communications, Primed, QDCME, Peerview Institute for Medical Education, one more, Research to Practice, Touch Independent Medical Education, Vindico Medical Education, and Right Medicine. As always, two ways that you can ask questions during CME Palooza. You can use the Horizon CME text line to send in a question, 267-6660-CME. You can also open up the viewing window in YouTube and ask questions via the YouTube chat. I'll be monitoring both of those. They both work equally well, so happy to take your questions either way. There will be a couple of poll everywhere questions, our audience response system. So go ahead and get that ready if you haven't already done so. You can either use the Poll Everywhere app, CME Palooza 005, or you can plug in this URL into your browser, pollev.com/CME Palooza 005. So go ahead and get that ready to go. And then the last thing from me, speaker disclosure, any opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or affiliates. So with that, I will turn things over to Alex.
Well, hello and welcome to our session on the power of podcasts in CME. You know, if you've been paying attention at all, the landscape of medical education, including CME, has undergone a significant transformation in recent years, with podcasts emerging as a favored learning format for many health professionals. Major medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA produce their podcasts, their own podcasts. And there are over 150 active medical education podcasts across many, many specialties, and some of them offering continuing education credits. The popularity growth stems from, I like to think, the unique benefits that podcasts offer. Convenience for busy clinicians, the ability to multitask while learning, although we might put a question mark over that, and rapid dissemination of information. As we explore the topic today, we'll examine how podcasts can reshape CME and talk about strategies to optimize their educational impact and potential. I'm Alex Housen of the Right Medicine podcast, as Derek introduced me, and I'm delighted to introduce a fantabulous panel of educators and podcasters. We have Celisa Steele, co-founder of Tagoras and the Leading Learning podcast, Jeremy Enns, founder of Scrappy Podcasting and Podcast Marketing Academy, and Dan Kendall, founder of the Health Podcast Network and Health Unmuted. We do have some polling questions for you throughout the session, and if you have questions for the panel, you can do what Derek told you to do, and we'll pause to respond. Before we jump into topics like listening as a learning modality, how to structure podcasts for education, and measuring impact, here's our first polling question for you, Derek. If we could have question number 1. What's your current level of involvement with audio-first content in your CME CPD programs? And we'll just wait for responses to populate there.
Alex, give me 1 second. It seems to have not been activated and poll everywhere. So give me a moment and I will bring it back up again.
Sure. Well, while you do that, Derek, let's jump into a kind of kickoff question for the panel. Celisa, let me turn to you first. Imagine you're advising a CME organization eager to launch its first podcast. What's the most important thing they need to consider as they get started?
Well, thanks, Alex. And I'll get to the question in just 1 second. I'll just remind folks I'm Celisa Steele. I am co-founder of Tagoras, and then we have a sub-brand, Leading Learning. And under that, we have the Leading Learning podcast. And we focus on what we call learning businesses. So these are organizations that have to market and sell continuing education, professional development, lifelong learning to adults. So it's not corporate L&D, and it's not the degree granting academic institutions. It's a lot of trade and professional associations. It can be commercial training firms, and it can be continuing education units at universities. And it certainly includes CME providers, though obviously the learning business umbrella is a little bit larger than that. So if an organization is thinking about starting a podcast, I would say that first and foremost, get really clear on your why. And I mean your why as the organization producing the podcast, because once you're clear on why it's important for you, then you're going to be clear about why it's important for your potential listeners. On the Leading Learning podcast, we talk a lot about reach, revenue, and impact, because we think those are kind of three core goals of all learning businesses. And my sense is that your why for having a podcast might tie to one or more of those three: reach, revenue, or impact. Maybe you're trying to drive revenue directly through the podcast, maybe through sponsorship or something like that. Maybe you're looking for revenue indirectly around promoting some of your other paid products that you're offering. Maybe you're looking to reach new learners. Maybe there's some learners who haven't been able to engage with place-based conferences, but the versatility of a podcast that lets them kind of access anytime, anywhere might appeal to them. Or maybe you're looking for greater impact, really kind of perhaps leveraging sort of that short time cycle of a podcast where you can kind of get from concept to content out in the world pretty quickly. So I think if you get clear as an organization on the why for the podcast, that's going to help you as you build it. It's also going to help you just as you sustain the effort that's needed once you launch it and put it out into the world. I think we're on 430 something episodes right now, and it does take a lot of time and energy. So I think if you understand why you're doing it, it gives you that stamina to launch it and to continue.
Clear on the why. I love that. Jeremy, what about you?
Yeah, so thanks for having and facilitating, Alex. So I'm Jeremy Enns. I'm the founder of Podcast Marketing Academy. And like Alex mentioned at the start, I also write the Scrappy Podcasting newsletter. And so I basically do deep dives into the marketing and growth side of things, more for established shows, although I do help a handful of shows every year kind of launch and develop as well. So what often happens in my experience, and I've worked with a number of kind of continuing ed podcasts. Typically, I work with brands and businesses and creators, and then there's also several organizations in there. But where I usually come in and work with people is that they've developed a show that is not gaining any traction. And so we now need to re-engineer what is wrong with the show that people are not paying attention. And a lot of times people think they have a marketing problem. They think, I just need to know how to talk about it on social media. I need to know what language do I use when I send out my email newsletter. How do I promote this thing to get more people in? And usually the problem is the show is not formulated in a way that is appealing to people's selfish interests. And so I think that we can talk about like the why behind you creating the podcast for your organization, but we also need to bring this why of like, why is somebody going to spend their 45, 60 minutes, 20 minutes, however long it is, listening to your show versus all of the other content that is available to them, which is all free. I mean, for the most part. And even if you think about, Netflix and like all these kind of content platforms that we're competing with, we need to have some kind of answer of like, why is this a priority for people? And how are we structuring the show to make it a priority for people? And it's not necessarily an easy answer. And that's why most people don't end up there, but it's certainly an answer that every organization can come up with a compelling response to. And I think that's the thing that most shows lack, but the shows that gain traction, build a following, have people coming back episode after episode, they have a solid answer to it, and then they also fulfill that answer.
So clarity on your why, knowing your audience is kind of an implicit theme in what you're sharing there, Jeremy, is what I'm hearing. Dan, what about you?
Hi, I'm Dan Kendall. I'm the founder of Health Unmuted and Health Podcast Network. Health Unmuted is, I describe it very succinctly as WebMD for your ears. So these are podcast mini series that are really crafted to serve people where they are on their health journeys, to give them information that they need to know when they or someone they care about have been diagnosed or are concerned about a condition. And I also run Health Podcast Network, which is a group of invited podcast creators that are in the health sector that have all been vetted for authenticity and expertise and quality to make sure they are human-centered and evidence-based. And we work with creators like Alex to promote their content, promote these things, this content through events, and do digital marketing as well. So really trying to raise the tide for all the ships that are working to create audio first content to serve listeners. So in terms of my response to this question, I think there are three things that I would say. First of all, to echo the comments earlier, but to put a little bit of different spin, know the audience, know the why, but think about actively how to serve the listener. They have elected, this is a theme that will come up in other topics today. The listener has elected to spend time and to click a button to select your content. How are they going to be served at the end of their journey, at the end of their commute, at the end of their shopping experience, or their exercise routine? Whenever they complete listening to your content, how are they going to be served? What's going to make their lives better? And think about them, put them at the center of the content you're creating. Second thing is, I see a lot of people overlook this, which it seems a little silly, but just want to remind people they need to allocate budget for this. A lot of people think, well, how hard can it be to create a podcast? Ask a lot of people who've been doing it for a while. They know it's pretty hard. And it's not just the creation of the podcast, it's also the marketing. So put some budget aside for the creation of it. And it's more than just buying some mics and using GarageBand or some other software to create some content, and then double that again for marketing, because it's not a matter of build it and they will come. You really need to put marketing to make sure that you can attract the eyes, put that content in the right places so you can convert that attention into clicks. And the last thing is, I would say, is that it's not a binary decision. A lot of organizations I talk to say, well, should I start a podcast or shouldn't I start a podcast? And I think that the task of creating content on a regular basis seems a little daunting. Oh gosh, I don't want to create an episode every week or every month or twice a month. And it can really put people off from ever getting started. So I would encourage people to think about the format that works with them, it works for them. And to, instead of thinking about a binary decision of do I start one or not, think about what do I want to serve people with? What information would I like people to have access to? What information do I find myself repeating dozens and hundreds of times, or my sales team or my field team? What information are they constantly being asked about? And how can we accelerate those connections on a one-to-many basis by creating some audio-first content that people can consume in the time that fits in with them, whether it's when they're brushing their teeth or cooking dinner or on the way to work. So those three things: serve the audience, make sure you set aside budget, and don't let it be a binary decision. Just think about what format you want: a season, a monthly, or whatever it might be, that you can create content and serve your audience.
So a great start there, to things to be thinking about if you are thinking about starting a podcast or you're early in your sort of podcasting journey. Derek, can we take, let's take the first two polling questions if we can. I don't know if that's possible, but we'll start with that first one. And some people have already responded. We're actively producing podcasts, considered but haven't started. We haven't considered podcasts for CME yet. So we have a kind of mix here, and we create audio versions of most of our content. We'll kind of dig into many of these topics. Derek, is it possible to just go straight to the second question? What's the biggest challenge in engaging health professionals in CME content, in your podcast content especially? Time constraints, yeah, relevance, demonstrating the return on investment. So we've got a kind of, oh yeah. Just watching the numbers change here. Time constraints is a big one. Okay, we've got a mix of responses there. So let's get into another question here and start to dig into some of those issues. Our first kind of exploration is really around podcasts as a learning modality. And so, Lisa, I want to ask you, what do you see as the benefits of podcasts for learning for healthcare professionals?
Yeah, so we know that learning styles are a myth, right? We're not visual learners or kinesthetic learners. We all learn through many of our different senses. Now, so while learning styles are bunk, learning preferences are real. And there definitely are some learners who prefer auditory content. And I think in large part, maybe prefer because of then that freedom that can go with just picking up your phone and being able to do it. As we already heard Dan and others saying, if you're exercising or you're brushing your teeth, whatever it is, to be able to be getting access to some high quality content without having to be at your desk or tied down. So I think that there is just a case around sort of preference and meeting your learners where their preferences are. I think another advantage to the podcast format in terms of a learning modality is that we know learning is most effective when it mimics real world situations, real world application. And I just think about a lot of healthcare professionals who engage with patients through conversation. So I think just the podcast as sort of this auditory, potential back and forth, even if you're just listening in, it kind of ties to a lot of the conversation that healthcare practitioners have to have. So I think that it also makes sense from that standpoint. So I would say both preference and then just mimicking some of the real world experience that folks dealing with CME have to deal with.
And those are strong. Those are strong reasons. Jeremy, how do you see podcasts kind of complementing, other, educational offerings or formats like webinars in the continuing education space?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly, when you compare to something like webinars, there's things that webinars are great for, potentially interactivity, and the higher resolution of having video, some visual content, as well as that interaction, and obviously there's the audio component as well. But I think a lot of times, I've certainly, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of webinars I've signed up for, and like, oh great, I'm going to get the replay, and I never watch that. And maybe that's good as a marketing tool, where it's like, okay, they got me onto their email list now, but if I haven't actually engaged with the content, am I likely to take the next step with that company anyway? Whereas I think that podcasting is just so much more flexible, and there are so many nooks and crannies in our days where we can fit a podcast in, but we can't fit in a kind of screen-based content of some kind. And so I think that that's certainly something that is a huge advantage to podcasting that most other, and really any other content doesn't really offer that. And the other thing is, like, so I teach by text and video and podcast and live, like one-on-one coaching and group coaching, and basically my business, I use every type of learning modality basically. And what I found is that the people who have success with me often learn from all of them in different ways, and they all do different things well. And so a lot of times, like, I think if we're thinking about pure information download into somebody's brain, like, text is probably the most efficient way to do that. You can read much faster than you're going to listen. And so if you're just doing a 10 steps to achieve this thing, the most efficient way to do that is probably by text. But I think we all know that information alone does not really help us get the result a lot of times. And so thinking about actually exploring conversations that have stories and anecdotes and hypothetical situations where we can really expand, and you think about the amount of information and the depth of information, the substance of information that we can get into in a conversation, in a podcast, that's very different than what we're going to get from text. And it's also hard to get somebody to commit to that in video format. And so I think podcasting is this kind of unique platform where there's this kind of assumed attention span that is much longer than most other formats. And so we don't quite need to be working as hard to get to the point. And we do want to pull people in right off the bat, but we also have a lot more leeway, I think, once we get people in, to actually explore some of these topics in more depth and more breadth as well than we might in more traditional kind of content channels. So I think that that's one of the huge benefits for podcasting, kind of as a complement to everything else that you might be doing.
Well, let's talk a little bit then about sort of content planning and structure. So Lisa mentioned, leaning into conversations between people as, a rich foundation for education. And you kind of touched on that just a little bit yourself. What strategies, Jeremy, I'm asking you this question, so back to back here. can CME providers use to move beyond the typical faculty interview format and create really sort of engaging conversational format? Because I think sometimes we just kind of assume because it's a conversation, people are going to be interested and drawn into that. But we've all had experiences where that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, I think that there are many ways to do this, and this is a somewhat complex topic, but I'll share like a couple ways to think about it that you might not have previously. I think like the interview format is nice in some regards because it's often seen as kind of easy, and I think, you know, the easiest path is not always the most effective. It's probably rarely the most effective, but there is something in terms of the content creation. It's like, oh, we can get a smart person to come on and we can talk to them, and they're just gonna like, you know, and give their knowledge to our audience, and like it's perfect kind of communication. It doesn't often work that way, and I think that a lot of times like conversations are compelling when you're in the midst of one, but if you're separated from one, like if you're just like sitting, you know, at a bar and listening to the average conversation around you, it's probably not very interesting. Even if it's like, maybe if it's on a topic you really care about, like probably you wouldn't actually just sit by for an hour and listen to those people talk, kind of rambling around these things. And so I think if you're going to do an interview show, I often like to bring some more structure to it and break it into segments. I would think about it. And so we might have going in a kind of like an overall arching theme, and then say, how can we explore that theme in 3 distinct ways? So there's these kind of like this break in the action. And maybe we kind of like signal that going in. So, okay, today we're going to talk about these 3 different aspects, or maybe we're going to talk about this one topic from 3 different angles. So let's take this topic and talk about it from the patient perspective. Then let's talk about it from the, you know, healthcare provider perspective. And then let's talk about it from this other perspective, or offer something else. And now we've actually given kind of a 360 view of this topic that also keeps the episode or the interview from just feeling like this kind of bland, flowing, like shapeless thing of like where the listener doesn't quite know where they are in it. And so thinking about segments, you can apply that to an interview, and you can apply that to any kind of show, really, whether that's a co-hosted or even solo shows or whatever that might be. These can also be heavily gamified a lot of times, where if you're doing it with you think about like the lightning round or something like that is a common kind of show segment format. You could also structure things like a devil's advocate segment, where it's like in every episode we say, okay, sell me on the opposite. You've just spent 45 minutes telling me this. Now, like, make the case for the opposite. That's like a really engaging segment that people are going to, once they listen through that, they're going to be like, oh, interesting. Like, okay, I can see a counter perspective to this. So that's one thing that I would think about. The other thing is going back to this kind of idea of what makes conversations interesting, I think a lot of times, is storytelling and narrative. And that's not to say that the whole episode follows this narrative arc that's like beginning to end and it's a plot, but it is saying like at least once an episode, I would try to elicit some kind of deep anecdote from somebody. And so getting them not just to speak from the 30,000 foot view about the concepts, but saying like, okay, tell me about, like, put me in your shoes, in your office, like walk me through a scenario that happened with a patient, and like, what were they feeling? Like, what was the look in their eyes? Like, and what was happening like to their physiology? And like, what were you feeling? What were you noticing? Like digging into the senses and pulling out like 1 to 2 moments in an episode, like that actually sticks with people. And so now they have this actual, because of, you know, I think a lot of people in this community know how mirror neurons work. And so now we have kind of experienced that ourselves to some extent by being in that room. And we're like, oh, and I remember the lesson that came with that as well. And so I think it's not going to be the whole episode, but trying to get one moment like that that's immersive, where we're digging into feelings and the senses. And that's going to be a much kind of more engaging and also more memorable episode.
No, that's so true. I think we probably don't actually use what we know about the senses enough in the learning content that we develop in CME, and that kind of takes me to you, Dan, because you know, a lot of your podcasts in the Health Podcast Network and other avenues, you really focus on health professionals and also incorporate patient stories. So, based on your experience, how can CME providers effectively incorporate patient stories, real world examples, the kind of scenarios that Jeremy's talking about into their content?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Plus one on everything that Jeremy just explained around storytelling. It doesn't always have to be narrative. It can be about feelings. It can be multiple aspects that are sort of looking at a problem. I think a lot of times in healthcare, we presume that the listener understands that what we have to say or what we're trying to communicate is so important that the listener may overlook their normal senses of what they choose to listen to and what they choose to engage with. As a matter of fact, that's exactly how I decided to get into podcasting. I was listening to something that about a topic that I cared about in healthcare, and I really felt a little disrespected as a listener because the people who created that podcast had one microphone. Both two people were sharing it, and the third person was on a speakerphone into the same microphone. And I thought, this is so ridiculous. I can't, this isn't even listenable, but I want to hear the content. I've got to be able to do a better job than these guys did. So I think we really need to think about that listening experience. Jeremy mentioned storytelling. He mentioned pulling people in. I recommend leading with a hook. You watch a movie, watch a TV show now, they put some sort of hook up there. That's the normal way that people have been conditioned to listen to content, whether that's, or to watch content, whether that's on a social media feed or on a movie trailer that they're going to go pay $18 to go see. So I think we need to think about, how do we put something up front that's going to catch their attention and make them understand what they're going to go through. The second thing is, what do people care about? I tell people this all the time when people ask to be on shows that I manage or that I work with. They say, "Oh, I want to come on. I want to talk about what we did for this and what we did for that. I want to talk about our product or our business for that." People don't care. What do people who are deciding to listen care about? They care about themselves. They care about their families. They care about how to do a better job at work. They care about how to solve their problems. So part of that hook and part of this, the answer to the question you've asked me about patients is, how do we get them to understand information that can help them be better? Everything that we do is transformation. Anything that you're ever telling somebody is around an opportunity to transform them from where they are at the beginning of an episode, which is uninformed about what it is that you're about to share, all the way through to the point where they are sort of like the hero's journey and they now have an understanding, they have some power to be able to go forth and be able to work with this. So just one last point specifically around your question around including patients. Some of the things we do is we use a patient voice at the very beginning of an episode, bring that person's story through the whole content, and then summarize at the end, or maybe give that patient a voice again at the very end. And something I really don't want to overlook here, which is the opportunity to incorporate patients, because with audio first content, you can protect their privacy. They don't have to use their real name. You don't have to show their face. You can change their voice. You can still have real authentic content, not AI generated, real people talking about their problems, embarrassing problems that they may rather not have people know about themselves. And they can still share that in an authentic way, because a lot of people who have experienced health concerns for themselves or their family members want to help other people, because all of us feel lost at the very beginning of our health journey. And we want to find a community, but sometimes it's hard to reach out. So we need to find those people that are willing to, and give them an opportunity with respect to their privacy and their concerns, that lets their voice get heard.
There's some really great ideas there about how to really dial into podcasts as a learning modality and enhance the good things that podcasts bring to learning. Let's take a little break here to focus on your questions, audience. Derek, what do you have for us?
I have 4 questions actually that have come in on the Horizon CME text line. 2 are kind of similar, so I'll combine them together. But here's the first one. And if you're addressing any of these later on, you can always wait to do that. But what do you know about podcasting now that you wish you knew when you were starting?
Jeremy, I'm going to go to you for this one.
I would go back to kind of something I said in the intro, but I think that podcasting really lives and dies by the strength of the content. It is really, really hard to market something that is generic and is not unique. And I think podcasting has changed so much in such a short amount of time. It's a very new industry. And so many people that I work with, and I assume everybody on the call here, they were inspired by an earlier kind of generation of podcasters when there wasn't a lot of competition. And so people just started a show and it just took off, and they would get, thousands or tens of thousands of listeners. And then they would say, hey, they tell their friends, you got to start a podcast. This works so well for us. And then, somebody would kind of hem and haw about it for maybe a couple of years, think about it. And then, they started thinking about it in 2017, 18. Then they finally started their show 2020, 2021. And now it's like a totally different world where you can't just start a show anymore. And so I think there's a lot of baggage around like how people think about podcasting from a lot of the marketing messaging that they've had from the podcast industry to some extent, around how easy it is to start. And like, it's probably easier than you think to start a podcast. It is probably much harder than you think to grow a podcast. And so I think now I would not start a show unless I had a clear idea on like, okay, what is the actual, like Dan was talking about hooks to episodes, but think about what is the hook to the show. And so the test that I always think about is the eyes light up test. And so you don't need to create anything. You can come up with the show concept, and you can go to somebody who's in your ideal kind of target listener base, and you can say, hey, so I just want to like tell you about a show that I came across recently. So here's the podcast. So it's a show where in every episode they do XYZ. And if that person is like, oh, what's the show name? Where do I find that? You're like, okay, we're onto something here. And if they're like, sounds kind of interesting, I guess, then you're like, okay, so this person should be in my target listenership, and they're showing no interest, or they're showing just like feigning interest to some extent. Like, that's a kind of warning sign here. And so I always start now with like, okay, can I get a 1-sentence or 2-sentence pitch that describes the show, what's interesting about it? And if I put that in front of people, I don't say I'm making this thing, because once I do that, they're then going to say, oh, great. Yeah, you should totally do that. I say, hey, I came across the show. Is this like interesting? Would you listen to this? And I kind of, fake it a little bit. And if they get excited, if they're asking more questions, then okay, we're onto something here, and this is a show worth investing time in.
And I think there's definitely, plenty of scope in the medical education and CME world in particular to really kind of think about the format and the structure, because so many are, interview based and or just really kind of drilling through, disease states and therapeutic interventions. Anybody else want to answer that question about what you know now that you wish you'd known when you started your podcast or started in the podcasting world?
I'll tell you what I was glad I didn't know. I'm glad I didn't know how much work it is, to Jeremy's point.
I hear you.
That naivety helped me get started in 2016. I had the idea in 2015 and launched it in Q1 of 2016. And that opened up a lot of paths. But I think now, those were sort of the Wild West days of podcasting. And as Jeremy was alluding to, there were a lot of people who sort of started, but it's really part of, and this might come up later, part of an omni-channel campaign. So it's not just, am I going to do a podcast? It's like, how do I use a podcast for what it can do that some of my other resources can't? So that's really the thing that I think people need to think about, is how they can utilize it to achieve their business objectives. Because your business objectives is not to get more downloads. Your business is being driven by other factors. How do you use the audio content to be able to fit into those objectives?
Yeah, great perspective. I think in the interest of time, Derek, can we go to the second question from the audience?
Yes. Which actually blends it kind of nicely to that response. Very simple question, but how much prep work do you usually do before a podcast?
So, Lisa, I'm going to ask you to open this question.
Well, I would say it depends. And I'll try to be a little bit more specific. We typically I have a co-host. So we have episodes that are just me and my co-host discussing things. Those tend to be less prep work. We come up more with a concept that we think is going to be relevant and of interest to the audience. We maybe sort of bullet out a few points that we want to make, and we do try to have a conversation, keeping in mind everything that Jeremy said, where we want it to have a little bit of a flow and not just be, kind of an amorphous, bunch of words that we're trading back and forth. If it's an interview, which is the other approach, one of us will interview someone, and then, depending on who that is, that might take actually fairly significant time prep. If, for example, it's someone who's written a book, we usually take the time to read the book, try to come up with questions based on that. So, you could certainly take a lighter approach, or if you have a larger team and you can sort of offload some of the research to someone else who comes back to you with questions, that could all lower down. But I would say we tend to probably have episodes that are between 30 and 45 minutes for the most part. And I would say for an interview, assume maybe 2 hours of prep ahead of time. And if it's just an us conversation, maybe just 30 minutes of kind of prep ahead of time.
Are any of you seeing kind of pushback on that sort of period of time? Jeremy, I know you talked earlier about, podcasts, still are for a lot of people a format where you can really go deep and you can have these longer conversations or longer episodes. But are you sort of hearing rumblings of, okay, 30 minutes is kind of my cutoff now?
It's in terms of like the length of the episode?
Yeah.
It's weird because like you look at a lot of the top shows are super long, and there's some people are making the case that, especially this maybe alludes to a little bit of something we'll talk about at the end, but as podcasting is going more towards video, and I'm not saying that you should even necessarily consider that, but the podcast industry, there's like a huge push into video. YouTube is making big moves in podcasting, and what some people are seeing is that there is a certain type of consumer. I don't know that it's this audience of people who would be listening to your shows, but where people will just have these long shows on in the background. And so you have a, Andrew Huberman or a Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss or whoever who has a 3-hour long interview. And it's kind of like you're doing the dishes. It's playing on YouTube on your TV in the other room and you're still listening to it. And so like there is this thing you can like glance over at the video version, but you're still listening. You might as well be listening on a podcast, but it's kind of this background ambiance almost where you're not really tuned in. And so that's not really the types of shows we're looking at here, but you do see that there is this trend where there is really long shows that are doing well, but I feel like it's almost going in both directions. There is, and a lot of times there's more preference for shorter. A lot of people want longer. And so to me, I'm just like, any show can work if it's, a well formulated concept and well executed episodes. And so I don't really worry too much about length. It's like, it's as long as it needs to be to achieve the result.
Oh, interesting. No, I like that. Derek, let's go to our third question. So this is our third question because you combined two, right?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
So basically the question is, part of a writing team that's developing a script for a podcast that is based on a recent webinar of the same topic, same speakers. Is there any tips that you might have for success in kind of converting over from one format to a podcasting format?
Who would like to answer that question?
I've done a bit of this. I would say that's a great question. Webinars, I think part of the importance of answering that question is thinking in advance about how the webinar is formatted. We're doing a webinar here. Alex has had several meetings with us about the overall structure. You see the way it is. I think if you want to create audio from a webinar, you can think about the structure of the introductions and the transitions between the different segments. And you can also play parts of that as you're having a conversation. Some in the question was the word script. I think it's really important that podcasts not sound scripted, and it's really hard to read a script without sounding like you're reading. It seems like it should be an easy task. Believe me, I've been on a lot of podcasts where they are scripted, and it's really hard to get people to sound natural, as if they're having a natural conversation when everything's written out in front of them. So think about it before you actually conduct the webinar. If it's already done, then I'd suggest you go back and put that into a tool like Descript or some other transcription service and go through the text and actually see what jumps out to you when you read it. And then go back and listen to the audio related to that. That's why Descript is a nice tool. You can do both at the same time. And then think about, how am I going to introduce that topic, or what is that topic? What is that comment that was said in the webinar? How does that open up a whole nother Pandora's box, which is great. You can even do that on old content. You can take a webinar that was done 6 months ago or 6 years ago and play that clip and put it into the current context of a new study, a new release, a new approval, or whatever it might be. So think carefully. And think about, again, what's going to serve the listener in the least amount of time. That's the question about how long should a podcast be. It should be exactly as long as it takes to tell the story, and not a minute longer. Because as you begin to get these things out there, realize you have thousands and thousands of downloads, and you've wasted a minute of people's listening time, just 1 minute, and you realize that you've taken thousands of minutes from people collectively. You really need to be careful around how do you structure that most effectively.
Yeah, I love that. I think buried in that kind of repurposing question is, often that assumption that we can do the same thing in a different format, but it needs a fresh perspective, and it needs that just a different way of thinking about how you're going to present it. Derek, can we go to another polling question? So this question is, how do you currently promote your CME offerings? Dan kind of alluded to this in one of his earlier comments. Let's see what your kind of current practice is. Email marketing, social media. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a mix there. People are still voting. All right, so certainly email marketing is a big one. Social media, kind of curious to know what that means for most folks. But let's dig into this question. Just a little bit around marketing and promotion. Dan, I want to turn to you first. Can you share some of your strategies of how organizations have used podcasts to market their other educational offerings or even non-educational events?
Sure, happy to do that. So you saw a few listed there in terms of the answers that were options for that question. But I think there's lots of ways to utilize this, from putting QR codes on websites. And you might say, well, why would I put a QR code on my website? People have already gotten to my website. But if you're having audio content, people might be on a work computer and not signed into their Spotify or Apple account. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to get that audio content out of the screen that they're watching and into their device, so that when they get on the treadmill or get into the car or get on the train, they're able to listen to your content. You can put this on email signatures. You can put QR codes in your slide presentations, into your webinars, anything that you print, business cards, or anything that you give away at conferences or on display stands. You can have those QR codes present. You'd be surprised at how many people overlook that opportunity when they're spending thousands and thousands of dollars printing things, and they can just put a little piece of QR code that can get people into a different pathway. So multiple different ways of getting the word out there. There are a lot of events that are beginning to open up podcasting opportunities for podcasters, so giving them free passes. We're working on one next week. We're going to go to Las Vegas for the HLTH Health Conference. We've got about 20 members of Health Podcast Network that are going to be there. They've received free media passes and booth space. They've built 2 booths that are exclusively for the use of our members. So the event actually has those podcasters acting as influencers, telling their audiences through their social media and email and in their work about the fact they're going to go to this conference. Then these podcasters are going to attend and create content. And then for the next 362 days after the conference and before the next one, that content is going to be able to be distributed for people to listen to. So you can use it as post sales for your event to say, hey, if you missed something, come back and listen to this content. Or pre-sales, hey, if this is what you missed, and these are the sorts of leaders who come to our event or come to our conferences, and this is why you should buy a ticket for the next one that's coming up.
And I do want to get into sort of building and engaging an audience, but Dan, since you're already talking, I know that you focus a lot on dynamic ad insertion. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're using that and how CME providers could use that to provide relevant supplemental content and
Sure.
and so on?
Wherever attention goes, that's where the industry, any industry, works to find ways to monetize it. And one of the ways to monetize the listener's attention is to put ads in front of them. We've been doing that with radio for as long as radio's existed. And with podcast ads, since these are podcast episodes, these are basically static MP3 files that get loaded up to the web and get served to people on their devices when they press a button to say play. What dynamic ad insertion is, or I call it dynamic audio insertion, the industry calls it dynamic ad insertion, but I prefer to think about it as audio. That listener has seen your content, your cover art, your title, some messaging, and said, I want to listen to that. They have exchanged their time for a tap for their time, and they've elected to invite you into the car on the ride home. And that optionality, that contextual relevance of that listener who has selected that content is a great opportunity for you to serve them even further. That was the answer to the very first question, was around serving that audience. You can serve them even further by giving them some piece of dynamic audio that is relevant for the time and place where they are. And we can augment this with additional targeting tools that we don't have time to get into today. That's a whole nother hour-long webinar. But you can actually target zip codes, cities, states, countries. You can exclude certain areas. You can focus on certain devices. So if you only want iPhone listeners or Android listeners, people who are listening on certain platforms like Apple or Spotify, and you can serve an ad directly to those people. We've worked with groups that have targeted certain geographies, like the state of Texas during South by Southwest. We've done this in European countries as well. So you can really target a message even in their local language. And then when that time of that ad has expired, if the event is over, whatever, that can come out of the lineup of ads that get served to listeners, and a different ad can be played. You can also mix that up with a lot of different content. That's part of what we're working to do through Health Podcast Network, is with about 100 shows that we have, over 100 shows. We are working with them and with advertisers and brands to leverage the attention that people are putting on that content with relevant information that serves those audiences in a more effective way.
And part of the the kind of process of marketing and promoting podcasts also involves engaging potential audiences and building that audience. So Lisa, what are some effective strategies that you see in building and engaging audiences for a CME podcast?
I think the key is to think outside the podcast episode, and then kind of try to bring it back to future podcast episodes. But I think in general, anything you can do to encourage real, honest exchange and discussion, you can do that through a variety of ways. I'm thinking, for example, of Ask Me Anything episodes. That's where you get your listeners. That once you have some audience and you're trying to engage them more deeply, you want to find out from them what it is they want to learn about. You can get those questions a lot of different ways, but at the high level, you sort of have the choice of either taking them live or gathering them in advance. I'm a planner. I like to get things in advance, so that's always sort of my preference there. But you can ask for them via email. If you have show notes where people can comment, you can collect them that way. You can collect them through social media. You could do something, as we've already talked about, like this kind of live webinar where you're in essence asking or answering questions that people have asked in the moment. You can go that way. But I think what you want to do is have that exchange, because podcasts do feel one-sided in the context of the individual episodes. But I think more broadly, when you think about your podcast, often you can think about it as an exchange, how to open it up to that discussion. So sure, maybe you're sharing it on social media or on your email list, but make sure that you're actually inviting people to react, to comment, maybe asking questions and trying to get them to respond back to that. I will say that we have show notes for all of our episodes, and we do allow comments on those pages so we can hear from folks that way. But I will say too, just as a quick side note, that we do have a number of listeners who have written to tell us that they're really not listeners, they're actually readers, because we make transcripts of our podcasts available and they prefer to access it that way. But in general, I think just treat those podcast episodes as social learning objects, right? You want to get the people engaging with it, responding to you, maybe interacting with their colleagues or their team around that content as well.
What about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, so I think there's the two parts here. There's the growing and engaging. And of course, to engage with an audience, you first need to build an audience in the first place. And one of the things that when you survey people, and there's lots of data on this about how they discover podcasts, it usually comes back to word of mouth, is that somebody told them about the show. And that might be a friend or a colleague. It could be they heard about it from a host on another show. They just heard about it on social media. And so I think that this is true for most of my favorite shows. I heard somebody talk about it. I wasn't targeted with an ad or anything like that. It was somebody listened, somebody liked it, and they said, hey, this seems like a fit for you as well. And I know there are shows that I currently have at least 2 shows that I'm telling everybody and anybody about. And it's just like, you can't help yourself when you come across that show and you want to share something that you love with other people. And I think that this is something that we often might think of as like just totally out of our hands. It's like, well, if people are going to talk about it, they're going to talk about it. But I think that this is actually something that can be designed for. And I think that the first thing is like, we could go way in the weeds of like, how do we create a listener experience that it's memorable to people, it's distinctive. These are things that we've kind of talked about and woven throughout this conversation, which should be something we're aiming for. But then the biggest thing in terms of like, there's giving people an experience they want to talk about. And then there are these kind of like recommendation blockers that I'll kind of refer to them as often, where there's these friction points where somebody feels like sharing this show is going to reflect poorly on me in some way. And so maybe it's that the cover art feels amateur. And so they're like, the show's great. And if you feel like, if your listeners are feeling like they have to caveat the recommendation, like don't pay any attention to the cover art, like, or the audio quality is really, really bad, but you got it's that show that Dan mentioned at the start. He's like, the information's great, but like, you got to bear with the show through those like 3 hosts around the mic and the speakerphone. Like these are recommendation blockers where people feel like, well, it's going to kind of, somebody's going to listen to this. And I know the show is great, but their first impression is going to be bad. And so if there's anything confusing or it doesn't feel legitimate in some way about the kind of external packaging, and so maybe the titles are nonsensical, the show title doesn't make sense, the cover art isn't great, the audio production quality, like these are all things you do once for the most part. And if you do a good job of them, now your show's kind of set up for success. But I am always shocked at how many solid shows there are that have just completely neglected this first touch points that every listener is going to have with the show. And that's something that both makes new listeners less likely to click in the first place, but it also keeps existing listeners who love the show and would recommend it from actually making those recommendations.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts there. So I really appreciate you kind of parsing those out. Too many P's there for me to get my tongue around. I think we've got about 5 minutes left or so. Let's see. We'll do a polling question just in a minute. I want to dig into learning design and outcomes just a little bit, since it's, this is a big issue for our field. Actually, Derek, can we run a quick poll question here? What's your biggest challenge in measuring the impact of your podcasts? Let's just see what this looks like for the audience. Make my screen a bit bigger so I can actually see it here. Defining appropriate metrics, collecting reliable data. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah. So metrics, collecting the data, linking the education to patient outcomes. Let's jump into this a little bit. So Lisa, how can podcast creators design their content to really sort of, optimize, knowledge retention and practical application? Because that's the practical application and patient outcomes are the kind of holy grails for those of us in CME.
I would say use your intro and outro very carefully. There's some question in the learning world around whether we need to expose learning objectives to learners. But what we do know, and there are studies showing that having learning objectives focuses attention. So if you can use that intro to sort of highlight for the listener what they should be listening for, some of those key points, that's going to then help them hear those when they come up in the conversation. Kind of ditto then at the end in the outro, you can make sure that you're kind of recapping those. So that way, they've heard it kind of 3 times, perhaps by the end of the episode. I think another thing to not be shy of is trying to engage the learner, get the learner to do something, take some action. So that can be reflection questions, getting them to kind of, pose a question and have them think about it and encourage them actually to hit that pause button before they continue on. And maybe you then kind of the episode gives some answers to that question that they've been asked, but you're getting them to do some of that thinking first. So that's really kind of priming them to learn. And I think too, you can suggest what I'll just lump under the heading of homework. It might be say, okay, hey, now you've learned about this concept, go share it with a colleague or go try it out in your practice the next day. But I think basically we want to help learners know what to focus on, and then we want to try and encourage them to go do something with that information or potential skill that they just heard about.
And in conjunction with practical application, Dan, what approaches do you recommend for measuring, effectiveness and impact of podcast-based education?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think downloads is what a lot of people look at, and I don't think that that's a very good metric. I think that we can spoof downloads. I think what we really need to look at are things like listening time and how long are people staying engaged. That information is available through some podcast hosts and podcast players like Apple and Spotify. They'll show you that data to see where that drop off is. It kind of goes back to that question, be able to understand a little bit more about how you should structure your episodes and where people might be losing their attention or where they might just be too long because they finished their workout or their commute by then. And by the time they come back out to drive home, there's a whole nother set of podcasts that are at the top of their app. So you really need to look at those listening times. And then also think about how you're driving those listeners back to your website, how to serve them, to sort of echo part of what Lisa said. if you know you've got an audio-based audience, you can be pretty sure that their hands are busy doing something. Their mind is free. That's what you're connecting with, but their hands are busy. So you can serve the listener even more to say, look, I know you're probably busy when you're listening to this. Come to our website. We have the 5 points that we're articulating here written down. You can download those. We have a slide that you can build into your deck to present to your colleagues and incorporate into your proposals or whatever it might be. So try to structure the content that you're creating as a way to actually have people come back to your website and identify themselves, get some additional value, and then because you don't know if they found you on the website and gone to your audio, or found your audio and can get into your website. So think about and there are tools that you can actually track the people who are coming from audio onto your website as well, pixels that you can use to track that sort of data as well.
And we are 30 seconds from the end of our time. We did have one last polling question for you, Derek. Do we have time to show that? Kind of in line with what Salisa was saying in terms of reflection and taking steps. What's one thing that you might do, if not today, this week, this month, to help you think about how you might use podcasts in your educational offerings? I'm already shopping for a fancy microphone. Let me check if my voice is radio worthy first. That's number B. Neutral. Yeah, a lot of neutrals. Okay, great. Thank you, audience, for your participation. And thank you so much to Salisa, Jeremy, and Dan for being our illustrious panelists in CME Soundcheck. I hope that you'll be able to take your CME podcasts from static to stereo learning. And thanks to Derek and Scott for handling the tech.
Sure. Thanks, Alex, and the rest of the panel. I think I can honestly say this was the best sounding session that we've had. Everyone with a wonderful voice. I'm slightly intimidated to even talk now. But that was fantastic. Lots of really great practical tips. So that was excellent. A lot of nice response. Someone we had a nice thank you in the chat for the session. So thanks to everyone. Reminder to the audience, when you have a moment, please take our survey. It's very helpful for us in just knowing what sessions you've been watching and what topics may be of interest as we plan for the next CME Palooza. And then lastly, for the next session, you can click on the link right on the live page. That'll be coming up in about 4 minutes at the top of the hour. Work, Play, Slay, Millennial Perspectives on Well-Being in CPD's Future, sponsored by DKB Med and Clinical Education Alliance. So again, Alex, thanks so much. Rest of the panel, thank you all for participating. And the rest of you, we will talk to you soon.